Alright, today we are going to be learning about solving quadratic equations. Just like we have in the last couple lessons, but we're going to be looking at a different method today. We're going to be looking at using square roots. So, before I get into any bulk of what we're going to talk about, I just want to review quickly what a square root means. So if I have the square root of the number 4, that has actually two answers, because the question is, what number times itself makes 4? Well, we know that positive 2 times 2 makes 4, but also negative 2 times 2, also negative 2 times negative 2, makes a positive 4. So what we can say is the square root of 4 is equal to plus or minus 2. And we're going to be looking at that for a lot of problems today. In fact, that does bring me into our big property of this lesson, and that is the square root property, where what we say, if we have a quadratic equation and we want to solve it, we can use this square root property method to solve it. Really, if we have x squared is equal to a number, and that's it, we can take the square root of both sides and get the answer. Now, if we can simplify the square root, like the square root of 4, we're going to do that. If we can't, like this number example, 15, we can't really find the square root of that. We don't really know what times itself makes 15. We can just leave it as plus or minus the square root of 15. So now let's look at some examples. So example 1, we're going to have two parts to this. We're going to have a part A, and then we're going to have a part B. They're two separate problems, so we're going to look at both. If I have x squared is equal to 16, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared, those actually just undo each other, the squared and the square root, so we're going to be left with an x equals, well, what times itself makes 16? I know 4 times 4 makes 16, and because of that square root property, we can say x is equal to both positive and negative 4. And if we were to put both positive and negative 4 back into the equation, 4 squared is 16, we're good there. Negative 4 squared is 16, we're good there. So plus and minus 4 is our answer to this first example. In our next example, x squared equals negative 4. If we take the square root of both sides here, we don't really right now know how to find square root of negative numbers. What we can say is x is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 4. However, our real answer is going to be there is no real solution. When you get into higher level algebra, algebra 2, you're going to learn about this idea called I, and that helps us deal with negative square roots, or square roots of negative numbers. Right now, all we're going to worry about saying is that there's no real solution when we have a negative within a square root. So now I want to move into example 2. And example 2 looks at what if it's not x squared equals a number. What if we have something like x squared plus 5 equals 5? Well, we're going to just isolate the x squared term first. So I'm going to subtract 5 on both sides and get x squared is equal to 0. And if I take the square root of both sides, we're going to get x equals plus or minus 0. However, 0 is not positive and it's not negative, so we just say x is equal to 0. And if we were to plug that back in to our equation, we would see that it does work out. I've got a couple more here I'd like us to look at. B, if I have 4x squared minus 25 and set that equal to 0, we want to isolate x squared. So first I'm going to add 25 to both sides. So I'm going to have 4x squared is equal to 25, and then I'm going to also divide by 4. So I'm going to get x squared is equal to 25 over 4. Now I can take the square root of both sides. Now the square root of 25 over 4, that's the same thing as the square root of 25 over the square root of 4. Now we know the square root of 25 and the square root of 4. So that means x is going to equal a plus or minus. Well, the square root of 25 is 5. And the square root of 4 is 2. So x is equal to plus or minus 5 halves. Now, I've got one more here in example 2, but I don't have space, so let me get a clean screen. What if we have something that looks like the quantity x plus 2 squared is equal to 9? Okay, well, so what we're going to do is the part that's being squared is already isolated. So we're going to take the square root of both sides to start. The square root of x plus 2 squared, the square root and the square just cancel each other out. So we're going to be left with x plus 2 equals, well, we know the square root of 9 is both positive and negative 3. So in this case, we're not quite done once we take the square root. We've got one more step. We have to go x plus 2 equals positive 3 and x plus 2 equals negative 3 and continue solving. So we're going to subtract 2 in both cases, really. In the first case, if we go 3 minus 2, we're going to get x equals 1. And in the second case, if we go negative 3 minus 2, we're going to get x equals negative 5, which means our answers are x equals 1, comma, negative 5. And we could also go negative 5, comma, 1. Same thing. All that means is we had two answers. So now let's look at example 3. I've got two more examples. Example 3, we're going to solve, I'm going to type this, solve the equation, and I'll write in the equation. So I'm going to give myself some space. And then we are going to round this to the nearest hundredth. So our equation is going to be 0 is equal to negative 2x squared plus 80. So I'm going to start by just rewriting my equation. 0 is equal to negative 2x squared plus 80. And I don't like working with negatives, so the first thing I'm going to actually do is add 2x squared to both sides. You could go and move the 80, subtract 80, that's fine. We're going to end up with 2x squared equals 80, and if you moved the 80, you would have negative 80 is equal to negative 2x squared. We're going to get the same answer either way. So now I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I know what 80 divided by 2 is. That's 40. So I'm going to have x squared is equal to 40. Now I take the square root. So x is going to equal the positive and negative square root of 40, which I'm going to use a calculator to actually estimate this. So in my calculator, it depends on the version you have, but typically if you hit second and the x squared button, that should get you to the square root. And then I just type in the number, 40, and I get that x is about positive or negative 6.32. The nearest hundredth means we go to 2 decimal places. Okay, one more example. So our last example, example 4, is a word problem. We say a zookeeper is buying fencing to enclose a pen at the zoo. The pen is an isosceles right triangle. There's already a fence on the side that borders a path. The area of the pen will need to be 4,500 square feet. The zookeeper can buy the fencing in whole feet only. So we can't get decimal or fraction values. We want to know how many feet of fencing should the zookeeper buy. So first, I am going to draw myself a little picture of what's going on here. I know that there's already some fencing along a path, and that this fencing needs to make an isosceles right triangle. So my picture is not going to be drawn to scale, but what that means is we're going to have a right angle, and then these two sides, so right here is the existing fence, and these other sides have to be the same. Isosceles means two legs, two sides of the triangle need to be equal. Now, there's some things we need to recall, to remember. The first is the area of a triangle. The area of a triangle is the base times the height divided by 2. Well, in our triangle, the base and the height are both x. So in our case, we're going to have x times x divided by 2, and x times x, that's the same thing as x squared. So we're going to have x squared divided by 2. Now in this particular situation, we're going to have 4,500 set equal to our x squared divided by 2. And we're going to solve this for x. So to do that, we're going to first multiply both sides by 2 to get 2 out of this denominator of the fraction. So on the left side, we'll be left with an x squared equals, well, 4,500 times 2, that's 9,000. Now if we take the square root of both sides, we're going to get x is equal to, well, the square root of 9,000 plus or minus the square root of 9,000. So this one, I'm going to type into my calculator and get a value. Square root 9,000. So that is going to equal plus or minus 94.9. However, we're dealing with length here, and negative numbers, they just don't work with length. So we found that, or find that x is just going to be 94. 0.9. But that's not the total amount of fencing we want. And the zookeeper can only buy fencing in whole number amounts. So why don't we just round this to 95 for x? That's fine if we have extra fencing. I'd rather have extra fencing than run out of fencing. But then that's only going to cover one side of this triangle, of this pen. So we need to double that. So if we double 95, we can say that the zookeeper should buy 190 feet of fencing. If we double 95, we get 190. And then that is our answer. And that actually wraps up this lesson on using square roots to solve quadratic equations.